there's a profound connection between the foundation of Jewish life in the Americas and the history of Sephardic Jews in Western Europe. And that's because, of course, the story of how Jewish people end up in North America is related to the colonization of the Americas by the Dutch and by the English. Obviously, when the Spanish and Portuguese did it, there were no Jews, maybe new Christians that could have been amongst them. But yet, when the first kind of open Jews are living in the Americas, right, they're being, broadly speaking, associated with the Netherlands or with the British. And particularly kind of focusing on North America, those communities, of course, think of the 13 colonies, yeah, those are British. And so there's a particularly strong connection between those communities and the Spanish and Portuguese community of London. Some of those congregations are founded around the same time as England's community is founded, and some of them are kind of founded more into the 18th century. But one of the manifestations of this connection, at least the theory goes, is in the names of those communities. Many of the communities have a similar type of name, something Yisrael. So She'erit Yisrael, Yeshuat Yisrael, Mikveh Yisrael, Nidche Yisrael, Nefutzot Yisrael, right? Many of them have this very kind of similar idea. And the question is where do those come from? The other question is, one of those early communities has a very different name, which is the community in Charleston, which was known as Beth Elohim, which is very different. So there's a whole question around, why is that one so different? So let's focus first on the names of all these other North American communities. And the theory goes as follows, that it's rooted in the story of the founding of the first Sephardic Jewish community in England, which of course is established in 1656, 1657, under the kind of support of the Amsterdam rabbi Menashe ben Israel. He comes over from Amsterdam. There's already a group of these conversos that are kind of organizing themselves here, but there's an interest in kind of establishing an open Jewish community. And in fact, he comes over and he interacts with what at that time there's no king, there's the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, and is trying to negotiate rights of settlement for Jewish people. Without getting to the whole story of how that plays out, what's important to say is that he has an ideology that underpins his desire to establish Jewish life in England. And that is found in a work that he writes that is known as Esperanza de Israel. In English, The Hope of Israel, in Hebrew, Mikveh Yisrael, where he lays out kind of a vision for the future, a messianic vision for the future, which as a Jewish person sees as the ultimate objective of the ingathering of the exiles, right, and the reestablishment of, right, Jewish national identity in the land of Israel, right, the Messianic age. And what he puts forward in there is an idea that in order for the ingathering to take place, what first needs to happen is Jews need to be fully scattered first, right? They need to be gathered from, according to the Bible, from the four corners of the earth. So he says if they're not in the four corners, then the gathering can't happen. Now, England name, right, Latin name was Inglaterra, which means the corner, right? Terra, the corner. And so this idea that England is the final edge of the land, right, the final end of the land, fuels this idea of, in order for the ingathering to take place, Jews have to first be scattered to the edge. They've gotten to the Netherlands, there's maybe Jews in France, but we need to have them scatter all the way to the edge, which is Inglaterra, right? And so he advocates they should go there. Cromwell is a religious person himself. He's Puritan. He also believes in the importance of the ingathering of exiles. And for him, he has other, obviously, long-term objectives for the Jewish people, which is rooted in Christianity. But he embraces this idea that, yes, Jews should need to live here too. Again, without getting into all of his rationale behind it. And so that is the ideology. So some have suggested that it could be that when then Jewish people end up in the Americas, they really feel that, right? We really have now gone to the edge of the world, right? We're all the way in this newly discovered land. And they adopt names that invoke these messianic ideas, like Mikveh Yisrael from him. But She'erit Yisrael means the remnant of Israel. Nefutzot Yisrael, the scattered of Israel. Yeshuat Yisrael, the redeemed of Israel, right? All these ideas that kind of have these really strong religious messianic overtones. And it could very well be that they've been inspired by this ideology of Menashe ben Israel, who obviously pushed for the establishment of Jewish life here. So you see that connection, and indeed, without getting into it within this talk, you see the influence on the architecture of many of the synagogues that will be built that are influenced when eventually Bevis Mark Synagogue is opened in 1701, kind of that architectural influence. So it's clear that there's this, connection between our communities, and we'll talk about more of those connections in the next talk. But obviously the interesting point about all of this is the one community that we would really expect to have a name like that, something Yisrael, would have been in London, right? That was that's where Menashe ben Israel kind of was that's what he was trying to achieve. But of course, that's not the name of the community at Bevis Mark Synagogue. It's not Bevis Marks, that's just the name of the synagogue, because the road is Bevis Marks. The name of the community is Sha'ar HaShamayim, Kahal Kadosh Sha'ar HaShamayim, Holy Congregation, Gate of Heaven. So of course, this does raise the question of whether, in fact, these New World communities with these Yisrael names are in fact influenced by Menashe ben Israel. If the community that you would have most expected to have a name like that in London, where he wrote his work Mikveh Yisrael for, isn't named that. So it's actually possible that that premise is not correct. And in fact, none of those communities were inspired by Menashe ben Israel's writings, but in fact were inspired by something else entirely. And here I want to suggest that it actually was based on the original Jewish community to be established in the Americas that was established well before Menashe ben Israel's work, The Hope of Israel, which is already in the 1620s in Recife, Brazil. That was a Dutch colony. It had been Portuguese. The Dutch had captured it. They controlled it for about 30 years. Portuguese Jews from Amsterdam go there, establish a Jewish community, and the name they give for their synagogue is Tzur Yisrael, Rock of Israel. They do it as a bit of a play on words because Recife means the rock, because that kind of eastern edge of Brazil is kind of this rocky outcropping over there. And so the area is known as the Rock. So the Jewish people played off of that and said, our synagogue is the Rock too, the Rock of Israel, which is a euphemism for God. When that community is overrun by the Portuguese in the 1650s, it leads many of those people to flee to places that are not under Portuguese control because, of course, they're worried about the Inquisition taking these former Portuguese conversos, new Christians, and persecuting them for now having, in their view, relapsed to Judaism. And so they leave. Some of them go back to Amsterdam, but some of them end up in other places in the Caribbean. And famously, some of them end up in New York City as well. At that point, it was New Amsterdam. And so it could be that actually, as they then go to other places in the Americas, well, it no longer makes sense to call their new congregations Tzur Yisrael. They're not in Recife anymore, Rock. So they name it other things that sound like that, like Nidchei Yisrael, Nefutzot, right? Those who were dispersed of Israel, right? Almost playing off of the fact that they are dispersed, not in Messianic ways, the dispersion of Israel, right? The idea that Jews are exiled to the four corners, but literally they are dispersed from Recife, from Tzur Yisrael, and so they're now She'erit Yisrael, the remnant of Yisrael, the remnant of Tzur Yisrael, the dispersed of Tzur Yisrael, right? And so they're kind of, would almost be She'erit Tzur Yisrael, Nefutzot Tzur Yisrael, etc. And so that might actually be the real reason for their names. So returning to London, so what's the reason for the origin of its name of Shar HaShamayim? Well, we'll see. It has a similar, perhaps, kind of naming to the community in Brazil, related to the location of the synagogue in London itself. So why is it called Holy Congregation Gate of Heaven? Well, there's a well-known story in the Torah, in the Bible, of Jacob falling asleep, having a dream of angels ascending and descending the ladder. And he wakes up and he says, how awesome is this place? I didn't realize this is, right, the house of God, right? This is the gateway to heaven, right? According to tradition, that was Temple Mount, right? And that association of house of God with gate of heaven, right, has made it that sometimes synagogues choose the name gate of heaven, right? Because it's a euphemism for house of God. I've mentioned in the past that there may be an added reason why this community here particularly decided to choose that name for a synagogue, was because they were located, this synagogue was built just within the walls of London. The walls were still here when the community was established, and just down the road was Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Moorgate, right? There were actual gates in the wall. There's streets that are now, right, that have those names, but that's where the gates were. And so it's likely the community was kind of deeply kind of aware of its kind of geographical location and said, those, we're surrounded by all these gates, those are the gates to London, but our synagogue is the gate to heaven, right? And so that there was kind of this interplay between their location and the name that they actually chose for themselves. And so they didn't choose the name associated with Menashe ben Israel. They actually chose a name that was very London based, I believe. That may be the origin of that one exceptional synagogue name in America, which was in Charleston, which was Beth Elohim. Because of course, Beth Elohim in Hebrew, in English, is house of God. That's the term that's used in the story with Jacob and the ladder, right? Ma norah makom hazeh en zeh ki'im bet Elohim v'zeh sha'ar hashamayim. The community in Charleston felt particularly close to the community in London, and presumably they saw themselves as kind of the satellite of the community in London. So the community in London was Sha'ar HaShamayim. So the same way of calling yourself Sha'ar HaShamayim is calling yourself Beth Elohim, right? Because the Torah puts the two of those things together. So I've seen some people sometimes suggest, oh, maybe there were Ashkenazi Jews there and they chose a very different kind of name. I think it's completely wrong. I think the reason is because they saw themselves as part of Sha'ar HaShamayim of London, and so they were clever and basically gave it the same name by using different words that are linked to each other, right? Zeh, right? Sha'ar HaShamayim, right? En Zekim Bet Elohim, right? This is none other than Beth Elohim. So once again, you see kind of the close connection between the Sephardic community in London and of course these Sephardic or Spanish and Portuguese communities that were established in the Americas. So as America celebrates its 250, it's already worth reminding that of course before it was its own country, it was part of Britain, and indeed all those original Jewish communities were also deeply connected to the Jewish community in Britain as well. Thank you.
Is there nothing in the archives about naming synagogue? Any records about?
Well, the other thing that's important to kind of mention in relation to this is that many of, obviously, the Jewish people who end up in those places are coming from London, right? We know, right, from our records, these people lived in London before they went there. And in fact, in the in the circumstance of the community in Savannah, Georgia, which I believe is Mikveh Yisrael, the original Jews that went there went as a group there. The community here actually sent people there. There was this provision within the community to pay the travel fare for poor people. So maybe you'd have some poor people in your community, you would give them a one-way ticket to someplace else and say, best of luck, finding opportunity in a new place. And there actually was a group that was sent to this, what at that point was a newly established colony in Georgia in 1733 under the kind of the governorship of James Oglethorpe. And there was a group of Jews that were sent from Bevis Marks specifically there. So actually even some of the kind of the founders of some of these colonies were actually Jewish people from London as well.
Sorry, I meant the naming of Bevis Marks.
In terms of the origin of the naming of Bevis Marks, I haven't seen any record of it. So, yeah. Okay, thank you all so much.